He was a police sergeant with 30 years on the job. He had buried one wife and told America the next one ran away. Miles, ghost hunter here. Drew Peterson knew how to investigate a crime. He also knew how to commit one. Bolingbrook, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, 35 miles southwest of the Loop. The kind of place where the houses all look the same, where the lawns are cut on Saturday mornings, where the American flag hangs on every third porch. The kind of place where nothing is supposed to happen. And for most of the people who live there, nothing ever does. But on Sunday, October 28, 2007, something did happen in that little brick house on Pheasant Chase Court. Something that would tear open a decade of silence. Something that would expose a pattern hidden in plain sight. Something that would force a state legislature to write a new law. A law named after a woman who was never seen alive again. This is the story of Stacy Peterson. And this is the story of Kathleen Savio. And this is the story of the man who married them both and buried them both in very different ways. This is the story of Drew Peterson. I want you to understand something before we go any further. The man at the center of this story was not some stranger in the shadows. He was not a drifter with a record a mile long. He was not a mystery. He was a cop, a sergeant, 30 years on the force in Bolingbrook. A man who had worn the uniform, carried the badge, sat in the patrol car, worked the cases, written the reports, testified in the courtrooms. He knew the system from the inside. He knew how detectives think. He knew what evidence they look for. He knew what questions they ask. He knew what mistakes they wait for. He thought he knew everything. And for a while, he was right. Let me tell you who Stacy Peterson was before the world started saying her name in past tense. She was born Stacy Ann Cales. She grew up in Illinois, the youngest of several siblings, in a family that had already lived through more than its share of tragedy. Her mother had disappeared years earlier. Her sister Cassandra would later say that Stacy grew up with a kind of grief that never quite settled. The specific, gnawing grief of a child who loses a mother and never gets an answer. That grief would shape her. That grief would follow her. Stacy was young when she met Drew Peterson. She was a teenager. He was already a police sergeant, already married, to his third wife, a woman named Kathleen Savio. Stacy worked at a hotel in Bolingbrook, and Drew frequented the area because of his job. They started seeing each other. Remember that age gap. Remember that circumstance. She was 19, he was 47. He was a married cop, and she was a teenager working the front desk at a hotel. That's not a love story. That's a warning sign. That's a red flag the size of a semi-truck parked across the highway. And nobody in that little family said a word. They got married in 2003. She was 20. He was 49. They had 2 children together, a son and a daughter. By the time she vanished, she was 23 years old, the mother of a 2-year-old and an infant, and she was living in a house she shared with a man she had started to fear. Let me be specific about what we know, because the details matter. Stacy had a pastor, a young man named Neil Shorey, who led her congregation. In the months before she disappeared, Stacy had been meeting with Pastor Shorey. She was talking about her marriage. She was talking about leaving. She was asking questions that a woman who is safe at home does not ask. She was telling her pastor things that a woman who is safe at home does not have to tell anyone. She had a sister named Cassandra Cales, a woman who would become, in the months and years ahead, the loudest voice refusing to let Stacy be forgotten. Cassandra talked to her sister almost every day. She knew Stacy's routines. She knew Stacy's plans. She knew that Stacy was preparing to leave her husband. She knew that Stacy had consulted a divorce attorney. She knew, because Stacy told her, that Stacy was afraid. She had friends who would later say the same thing. Friends who would repeat, under oath, the phrases Stacy had used. Phrases that would become haunting echoes in a courtroom. Phrases that began with the words, ____, quote, underscore, 0, underscore, underscore. Now let me tell you about the other woman in this story. Let me tell you about Kathleen Savio. Kathleen was Drew's third wife. She was an Italian-American woman from the Chicago suburbs, dark-haired, strong-willed, and by every account from the people who knew her, she was nobody's pushover. She had married Drew in the 90s, and they had 2 sons together. The marriage was, by the time it ended, a war. Kathleen and Drew had fought in the way that couples fight when the marriage is not going to survive. Police reports, restraining orders, custody disputes, financial disputes, the slow, grinding, brutal mechanics of an American divorce where both sides are dug in and neither side is budging. In the years before her death, Kathleen called the police to her own home multiple times. She filed orders of protection. She told her friends and her sister and her father and anyone who would listen that she was afraid of Drew. She told them he had threatened her. She told them, in the specific, chilling language of a woman who has been paying attention, that if anything ever happened to her, it would not be an accident. It would be him. She said those words. Her friends remembered those words. Her sister Anna Doman remembered those words. Her attorney remembered those words. She said them over and over again in the last year of her life to anyone who would listen. Quote 1. The divorce was nearly final. The financial settlement was days away. Kathleen stood to gain a significant amount in the division of marital assets. She had told her friends she was looking forward to starting a new life. She was 40 years old. She had 2 young sons. She had plans. On the night of February 29, 2004, Kathleen Savio was alive in her home at 397 Pheasant Chase Court in Bolingbrook, Illinois. On the evening of March 1, 2004, she was found dead in her bathtub. Her hair was wet. Her body was dry. There was a small laceration on the back of her head. The water had drained. There was no water in the tub when the neighbors found her. There was no evidence of a struggle that anyone thought to look for. The initial investigation was quick. The coroner ruled the death an accident. The theory was that she had slipped in the bathtub, struck her head, lost consciousness, and drowned. The case was closed. The file was put away. The divorce was voided by her death, and Drew Peterson, who was still technically her husband until the settlement was signed, inherited her share of the marital assets. He moved on. He married Stacy later that same year. The file sat. For 3.5 years the file sat, and a police sergeant went about his business. And everybody in Bolingbrook forgot about Kathleen Savio. Everybody except the people who loved her. Everybody except her sister Anna. Everybody except her father. Everybody except the friends who remembered exactly what she had told them in those final months. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore 2, underscore, underscore. Now we come to October 2007, Sunday the 28th, the day Stacy Peterson disappeared. I want you to understand the timeline, because the timeline matters. That morning, Stacy was at home. She had plans that day. She had told her sister she was going to call her later. She had told a friend she was going to help paint a house. She had her 2 young children with her. She was doing what a young mother does on a Sunday morning. Drew was home too. The couple had been fighting, reportedly, for months. Stacy had told her pastor she was planning to leave. She had spoken to a divorce attorney. She had made plans that, by Sunday night, she would never get to follow through on. By evening, Stacy was not answering her phone. Cassandra called, no answer. Friends called, no answer. Cassandra started to worry. She drove over to the house. The car was there. Drew was there. The kids were there. Stacy was not. Drew's explanation was simple, and to take in some money and run off with another man. He said she had called him and told him she was leaving. He said she would come back. He said it was no big deal. He said not to worry about it. Cassandra did not believe him, not for 1 second. She knew her sister. She knew that Stacy would not leave her children. She knew that Stacy would not disappear without telling her. She knew that Stacy was in fact preparing to leave, but not the way Drew described. She was preparing to leave with the kids, with a plan, with a lawyer, with an exit strategy. She was not preparing to run off with some phantom boyfriend and abandon 2 small children. Cassandra went to the police, and here is where the first problem surfaces. The police department in Bolingbrook, the department where Drew Peterson had worked for 3 decades, was not immediately treating this as a suspicious disappearance. The sergeant who vanished his wife was the same sergeant who had friends, colleagues, and institutional history on every rung of that local ladder. Investigators from outside agencies eventually had to step in. But even as the search for Stacy began, something else was happening. Something that would change everything. The story hit the media. And when I say it hit the media, I mean it detonated. A young, beautiful mother vanishes, and her husband is a cop? That's a story. That's a headline. That's every cable news network running segments for weeks. And when reporters started digging, they didn't just find Stacy. They found Kathleen. They found the previous wife. They found the dead woman in the bathtub. They found the ruling of accidental drowning. They found the divorce that was never finalized. They found the inheritance that Drew received, and the public, and the Illinois State Police, and the FBI, and the Will County State's Attorney started asking a question that nobody in Bolingbrook had bothered to ask for 3.5 years. What if Kathleen Savio's death wasn't an accident? In November of 2007, just weeks after Stacy disappeared, prosecutors did something rare. They exhumed Kathleen Savio's body. They ordered a second autopsy. They brought in an independent forensic pathologist, Dr. Larry Blum, to examine the remains. And in the days after that examination, the world learned something that the family had been saying for years. The world learned something that Kathleen herself had predicted. Kathleen Savio did not die by accident. The second autopsy found that the injuries on Kathleen's body were inconsistent with a simple slip and fall in a bathtub. There were multiple bruises on her arms, on her torso, on her body, that suggested a physical struggle. The laceration on the back of her head was deeper and more serious than the initial examination had suggested. The position of the body, the dry bathtub, the lack of water, the nature of the injuries, all of it pointed to something very different from an accidental drowning. Dr. Blum's conclusion was that Kathleen Savio's death was a homicide. Her death was reclassified. The case was reopened. And now we come to the central problem of this investigation. Because here is what the prosecutors faced. Here is the dead end that nearly swallowed this case whole. There was no direct physical evidence tying Drew Peterson to Kathleen's death. No DNA, no fingerprints, no confession, no eyewitness to the act itself. The scene had been cleaned. The investigation had been botched. 3.5 years had passed. Any trace evidence that might have existed on March 1st, 2004 was long gone by November 2007. What they had was circumstantial evidence. What they had was motive, the divorce, the money, the custody dispute. What they had was opportunity. Drew had no alibi for the night she died, and he was the only person with easy access to her home. What they had was pattern. A wife who said repeatedly she was afraid of him. A wife who said she knew he would kill her. And a wife who then died in a manner that was ruled accidental, but looked, under closer examination, to be anything but. What they had, more than anything, was what Kathleen herself had said. In those last months, to her friends, to her sister, to her attorney, to her pastor, to anyone who would listen, she had told them, over and over. If I die, it's him. She had left, in effect, her own statement from beyond the grave. But there was a problem, a big problem, a problem that had been a foundational principle of American jurisprudence since before the founding. Those statements were hearsay. Hearsay is, at its simplest, an out-of-court statement offered in court to prove the truth of what was said. If your friend tells you that John stole a watch, and you try to testify in court that John stole the watch based on what your friend said, that's hearsay. The general rule, for very good reasons, is that hearsay is not admissible. The person who said the thing has to come to court and say it themselves, under oath, subject to cross-examination. That's how American courts have worked for centuries. That's how we protect defendants from being convicted on the basis of second-hand rumors and whispers. But Kathleen Savio could not come to court. Kathleen Savio was dead. And the prosecutor's argument was this: the defendant is the reason she cannot testify. The defendant silenced the witness. Should the defendant benefit from his own crime? Should the law allow the very act that prevented her testimony to also prevent the jury from ever hearing what she had to say? This was not a small legal question. This was a fundamental tension in the law. And in 2008, something extraordinary happened. The Illinois legislature passed a new law. A law that addressed exactly this situation. A law that came to be known in every courtroom and every newspaper and every bar association meeting in the state by one name: Drew's Law. Drew's Law was formerly known as the Forfeiture by Wrongdoing Statute. It codified a principle that had existed in some form in the common law, that if a defendant had silenced a witness through his own wrongful conduct, the defendant forfeited his right to object to that witness's statements being admitted against him. If Drew Peterson had killed Kathleen Savio to prevent her from testifying in a divorce proceeding, or to prevent her from ever being able to tell anyone what he had done, then her statements to her friends, her sister, and her pastor could come into court. They could be heard by a jury. The law was passed. It was signed by the governor. It was, effectively, written for one case. It was, effectively, written with Drew Peterson's name in mind. And in May of 2009, the Will County State's Attorney James Glasgow filed formal charges against Drew Peterson for the murder of Kathleen Savio. The breakthrough had come. Not from a confession, not from physical evidence, but from a change in the law itself. And that change in the law had been made possible by the disappearance of a second wife, a disappearance that forced the state of Illinois to look again at a case that had been ruled for 3.5 years to be nothing more than a tragic accident in a suburban bathtub. Now I want to pause here, because I want you to understand what kind of man Drew Peterson was while all of this was happening. Because this is the part of the story that sets it apart. This is the part that made Drew Peterson a national figure, a cable news fixture, a punchline, and ultimately his own worst enemy. Most suspects, when they are under this kind of microscope, disappear. They hire a lawyer. They stop talking. They let the process unfold. They understand that every word they say in public can and will be used against them. That is basic self-preservation. That is basic survival instinct. That is the first thing any lawyer tells any client facing a murder investigation. Drew Peterson did the opposite. He gave interviews. He appeared on the Today Show. He appeared on Larry King. He did radio. He did local news. He did national news. He showed up on camera wearing sunglasses, smirking, cracking jokes, making light of the situation. He called into radio shows and flirted with hosts. He appeared on a show called Dr. Phil and treated the whole thing like a performance. He held what he called a Win a Date with Drew contest as a publicity stunt. He put on a Halloween mask of himself and posed for photographs. He gave the finger to reporters outside his house. He treated the entire national tragedy unfolding around him as a game, as a joke, as an opportunity for attention. And every time he opened his mouth, he dug himself deeper. Because here is the thing about juries. Here is the thing about public opinion. Here is the thing about how cases like this actually play out. A defendant who sits quietly, who looks appropriately grave, who lets his lawyers do the talking, can sometimes survive even a very strong circumstantial case. A defendant who grins on camera while reporters ask him about his missing wife, who jokes about it, who turns it into a punchline. That defendant is building the case against himself. That defendant is showing the world, and eventually a jury, exactly who he is. Drew Peterson had spent 30 years as a police sergeant. He had watched hundreds of suspects. He had interrogated dozens of them. He had sat across from men trying to lie their way out of trouble. And he knew every tell, every tick, every crack in the facade. He knew what guilt looked like and what innocence looked like. He had built an entire career on reading people. But he could not, apparently, read himself. Or maybe he could. Maybe he knew exactly what he was doing. Maybe his ego was so large, his confidence in his own intelligence so total, that he genuinely believed he could charm, joke, and smirk his way out of 2 murder investigations. Maybe he thought he was smarter than the prosecutors, smarter than the media, smarter than the jury that was eventually coming for him. Maybe he thought the rules that applied to every other suspect did not apply to him, because he was a cop, and he knew how the game worked from the inside. If that is what he thought, he was about to learn a very expensive lesson. The indictment came in May 2009. Drew Peterson was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder in the first degree for the death of Kathleen Savio. He was not charged in the disappearance of Stacy Peterson because Stacy's body had never been found, and the prosecutors, after years of investigation, did not believe they had enough evidence to bring that case. Stacy's case remained open. It remains open to this day. But for the purposes of a courtroom, in 2009, the charge was Kathleen. He was held on $20 million bond. He did not post it. He sat in the Will County Jail while his legal team prepared for what would become one of the most watched trials in Illinois history. His lead attorney was a man named Joel Brodsky. Brodsky was a Chicago lawyer, a defense attorney with a flair for the dramatic, a man who, like his client, seemed to enjoy the cameras. Brodsky and Peterson made a pair. Press conferences, interviews, banter. Brodsky went on television and made claims that prosecutors had no case, that the second autopsy was junk science, that Drew's law was unconstitutional, that the entire prosecution was a political witch hunt driven by media hysteria. For a while, some of those arguments had traction. The law was novel, the appeals were extensive, the case dragged. The trial did not begin until 2012, 3 years after the arrest, nearly 5 years after Stacy's disappearance, more than 8 years after Kathleen's death. A long time, long enough for memories to fade, long enough for evidence to weaken, long enough for the defense to argue, plausibly, that the state had no business bringing a case this stale. But the state had something the defense could not neutralize. The state had Kathleen's voice. It had her friends. It had her sister. It had her pastor. It had her attorney. It had the people she had spoken to in those final months, the people who had listened as she told them, over and over, that she was afraid, that she knew what was coming, that if she died, it would not be an accident. The lead prosecutor was James Glasgow, the Will County State's attorney. Glasgow was a career prosecutor, a veteran of the Illinois criminal courts, a man who had built his reputation on carefully constructed cases. He was not flashy. He was not theatrical. He was exactly the kind of prosecutor you want when you are trying to convict a defendant who is more famous than you are. A defendant who had been on every talk show in America for 4 years. A defendant whose face was more recognizable than the flag in the courtroom. Glasgow knew he had to be the calm, careful, measured presence in a room that was going to be dominated, whether he liked it or not, by Drew Peterson's personality. Jury selection took weeks. The pool had to be screened for people who had somehow not formed an opinion about Drew Peterson, a nearly impossible task in Illinois in 2012. Eventually, a jury was seated. 12 citizens, 7 women and 5 men, ordinary people from Will County, asked to decide whether the evidence, circumstantial, old, filtered through the voice of a woman who could not speak for herself, was enough to convict a former police sergeant of murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial opened on July 23, 2012. In his opening statement, James Glasgow laid out the case. He told the jury about Kathleen Savio. He told them about her marriage to Drew. He told them about the divorce, the money, the fights, the threats. He told them about the night she died, alone in her home, in a house Drew had a key to, with no alibi and every motive. He told them about the second autopsy. He told them about Dr. Larry Blum's conclusions. And then he told them something crucial. He told them that they were going to hear from Kathleen herself, not in person, but through the voices of the people she had trusted with her fears. Joel Brodsky's opening was combative. He attacked the science. He attacked the investigation. He attacked the motives of the prosecution. He told the jury that this was a case built on gossip and hearsay, that the original coroner had gotten it right, that the second autopsy was the product of political pressure and media circus. He told the jury that there was no physical evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses connecting Drew Peterson to his wife's death. And he was right about that. There wasn't. That was the defense's strongest card, and Brodsky played it hard. The state began calling witnesses. The first wave was forensic. Dr. Larry Blum took the stand and walked the jury through his findings. The bruises, the nature of the head wound, the inconsistencies with a slip and fall, the position of the body, the dry tub. He testified with the caution of a careful scientist and the clarity of someone who had spent a career explaining medicine to lay people. The defense cross-examined him hard. They brought their own experts. They argued that the original ruling was defensible, that the injuries could have come from a fall, that Blum was reading too much into inconclusive evidence. It was the kind of forensic back and forth that can leave a jury confused and reaching for reasonable doubt. But then came the hearsay witnesses, the witnesses that Drew's law had made possible. Kathleen's friends took the stand one by one, women who had known her for years, women who had sat with her at kitchen tables and in coffee shops in the months before her death, women who had listened as Kathleen, a woman they described as strong and proud and not prone to exaggeration, told them that she was afraid for her life. One by one, they repeated her words. He said he would kill me. He said he could make it look like an accident. If something happens to me, it's him. He will get away with it if you let him. Don't let him get away with it. The jury listened. The jury watched these ordinary women who had nothing to gain by testifying, who had come to court only because the woman they had loved had asked them to remember, repeat words that had been spoken in private conversations 8 years earlier, words that had echoed in their heads for all those years, words they had been waiting, in some cases, since 2004 to finally say out loud, in a place where someone had to listen. Kathleen's sister, Anna Doman, took the stand. She testified about the same conversations, about the same fears, about Kathleen's conviction that her husband was going to kill her. Anna had been one of the loudest voices in the years after Kathleen's death, one of the family members who had refused to accept the accident ruling, one of the people who had pushed for the exhumation and the second autopsy. On the stand, she was composed, clear, and devastating. Kathleen's pastor testified. Kathleen's divorce attorney testified. Each of them brought a piece of the same picture. A woman who knew, a woman who had warned, a woman who had tried to leave a record in case the worst came true. And then the state pivoted to Stacy. Now here is where the law gets interesting, and here is where the judge had to make careful rulings. Drew was not on trial for Stacy's disappearance, but the state argued, and the judge ultimately allowed to a limited degree, that Stacy's statements were relevant to Kathleen's case. Because Stacy, in the weeks before her own disappearance, had allegedly told her pastor Neil Shorey something that went to the heart of Kathleen's murder. Pastor Shorey took the stand. He described his counseling sessions with Stacy. He described a young woman under tremendous stress, a young woman planning to leave her marriage, a young woman carrying a terrible secret. And he described what she had told him. She had told him, according to his testimony, that Drew had confessed to her, that Drew had told her he had killed Kathleen, that Drew had described how he had done it, that Drew had said he could make anything look like an accident. Pause on that for a moment. Let that sit with you. Because what the jury had just heard, filtered through the voice of a young pastor who had no reason to lie, was essentially a confession. A confession Drew had allegedly made to his fourth wife about the murder of his third. A confession that had been carried in private by the woman he told it to, until that woman disappeared, and then carried in testimony by the only person she had shared it with. The defense fought this tooth and nail. They argued that this was hearsay upon hearsay. They argued that Shorey's memory could not be trusted. They argued that Stacy was not a reliable reporter. They argued every legal and factual objection they could find. But the statements came in, the jury heard them, and the jury was going to decide what weight to give them. Throughout the trial, Drew sat at the defense table, and Drew did what Drew had always done. He smirked. He joked with his lawyers. He rolled his eyes during testimony. He leaned back in his chair. He whispered loudly. He acted, by every account of every courtroom observer, like a man who could not believe anybody was taking this seriously, like a man who thought the whole thing was beneath him. Jurors notice that. Jurors remember that. Jurors watch a defendant the way a cat watches a bird. Every gesture, every expression, every reaction to every piece of testimony. And what they saw, day after day, was a man who did not seem to be grieving his dead wife. A man who did not seem to be concerned about the disappearance of his other wife. A man who seemed, above all, amused. The defense called its own witnesses, their own forensic experts. They tried to rebuild the accidental drowning theory. They tried to poke holes in the hearsay witnesses. They tried to suggest that Kathleen had been paranoid, that her statements were exaggerations, that the friends and sister had their own grievances against Drew and could not be trusted. But Joel Brodsky made decisions during this trial that would haunt him later. One of them was calling a witness named Harry Smith, an attorney who had, years earlier, represented Stacy Peterson. Brodsky believed Smith's testimony would help the defense by suggesting that Stacy had her own motives for making claims against Drew. Instead, Smith testified that Stacy had told him Drew had killed Kathleen, and that Stacy had considered using that information as leverage in her own divorce plans. The defense had opened a door. The state walked through it. After the trial was over, co-counsel for the defense would publicly criticize Brodsky's decision to call Smith. They would call it the worst decision in the case. They would say it handed the prosecution a gift. And they would be right. That single witness, called by the defense, may have sealed Drew Peterson's fate. Closing arguments were September 4th, 2012. James Glasgow stood up and walked the jury back through the evidence. He reminded them of Kathleen. He reminded them of her voice, speaking through her friends, her sister, her pastor. He reminded them of the motive, the money, the divorce, the loss of control. He reminded them of the opportunity, the house, the key, the lack of alibi. He reminded them of the second autopsy and what it showed. And he reminded them of Stacy, the fourth wife, who had heard too much and who was no longer here to tell anyone what she had heard. He asked the jury to do something that Kathleen Savio had been asking, through her friends, since before she died. He asked the jury not to let Drew Peterson get away with it. Joel Brodsky gave the defense closing. He hammered on reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury that there was no physical evidence. He reminded them that the case was 8 years old. He reminded them that the first autopsy had ruled the death an accident, and that only political and media pressure had changed that ruling. He told them that if they were going to convict his client, they had to do it on evidence, not on feelings, not on gossip, not on the personality of the defendant. He told them their duty was to the law. The jury went out on September 4th. They deliberated. Not for an hour, not for a day. They deliberated for 2 days. On September 6th, 2012, the jury returned. The foreman stood. The verdict was read. Guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Savio. Drew did not smirk at that moment, not according to the people in the courtroom. For once, his face went blank. For once, he seemed to understand that the game he had been playing for almost 5 years was over. The cameras were no longer his friends. The reporters were no longer a tool. The ego that had carried him through every interview, every television appearance, every jail call, was, in that one moment, useless to him. On February 21st, 2013, he was sentenced. 38 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. He would be over 90 years old before he would be eligible for release. Functionally, a life sentence. Functionally, he was never getting out. He was sent to Menard Correctional Center, a maximum security facility in southern Illinois. He was placed in protective custody because former police officers do not last long in general population. And that should have been the end of the story. It was not, because Drew Peterson, even in prison, could not let it go, could not accept what had happened, could not accept that the man responsible for putting him there, James Glasgow, the prosecutor who had built the case, who had run the law that bore Peterson's own name in the newsrooms, who had stood in that courtroom and asked the jury to deliver justice, was walking around free. In late 2014 and into 2015, Drew Peterson from his prison cell began speaking with another inmate. He began telling this inmate, in conversations that the inmate recorded and reported, that he wanted to have James Glasgow killed. He talked about it repeatedly. He talked about paying for it. He talked about arrangements. He talked about how it could be done from the inside. Let me say that again. A man convicted of murdering his wife, a man who was already serving 38 years, tried, from inside a maximum security prison, to arrange the murder of the prosecutor who had convicted him. This is the part where you understand something fundamental about Drew Peterson. The conviction did not change him. Prison did not humble him. Time did not give him perspective. He was still the same man he had been in 2004, and in 2007, and in 2012. The same man who believed he could outmaneuver any system, any investigator, any prosecutor. The same man who believed the rules did not apply to him. The same man who thought his ego was smarter than the institutions around him. It was not. The inmate he confided in was cooperating. The conversations were documented. The evidence was clean. In February 2015, Drew Peterson was charged with solicitation of murder for hire and solicitation of murder, 2 felonies that carried their own lengthy prison terms. In April 2016, he went on trial again, this time in Randolph County, Illinois, not far from the prison where he was housed. This trial was faster. The evidence was stronger. The recordings were damning. Peterson took the stand in his own defense. Big mistake. Under cross-examination, he came across exactly the way he had always come across on cable news. Arrogant, dismissive, sarcastic, unable to take anything seriously. He blamed the inmate witness. He blamed the prosecution. He blamed the justice system. He blamed everyone but himself. The jury did not buy it. He was convicted on May 31st, 2016. On July 27th of that year, he was sentenced, 40 additional years, to be served consecutively with the 38 he was already serving. That meant 78 years. That meant Drew Peterson, in any realistic sense, would never see the outside of a prison again. He would die in custody. He was moved to federal custody for his own safety after that conviction. A cop who had tried to have a prosecutor killed was not going to survive a regular prison population. He has been shuffled between federal facilities ever since. He is, as of the most recent public information, still alive and still behind bars. A man in his 70s serving sentences that stretch past a century. And that is the story the courts told. That is the story that ended with verdicts and sentences. That is the story with an ending. But there is another story, a story that does not have an ending, a story that remains, even now, nearly 2 decades after it began, a gaping open wound. And that is the story of Stacy Peterson. Stacy Peterson has never been found, not her body, not her remains, not a single piece of physical evidence definitively tied to her disappearance. Over the years, there have been searches, there have been tips, there have been leads that went nowhere. There have been confessions, some credible, some less so, from jailhouse informants and hangers-on who claim to know where she is. None of them have ever produced her. Her children, the son and daughter she left behind, who were 2 years old and a few months old respectively when she vanished, have grown up. They have been raised by other family members. They know what happened, or they know as much as anyone knows. They carry a grief that is different from the grief of a normal loss. It is the grief of an absence without closure. It is the grief that Stacy herself carried when she was a child, the grief of a mother who is gone but not accounted for. The pattern, in the most terrible possible way, has repeated. Cassandra Cales, Stacy's sister, has spent the years since Stacy's disappearance refusing to let her be forgotten. She has searched, she has spoken, she has pushed, she has held on to hope and then let go of hope and then found new reasons to hope again. She has done what family members do in cases like this. She has fought, year after year, for a resolution that may never come. And Drew Peterson, in his federal cell, has never told anyone where Stacy is. He has denied any involvement in her disappearance. He has maintained, for almost 2 decades, that she ran off with another man. He has never varied from that story. He has never cracked. He has never offered even the smallest concession to the family that has been searching for her. Maybe that is the final cruelty of the whole story. That even with no further prison time to lose, even with no reason left to lie, even with every appeal exhausted and every verdict secured, he will not give them what they need. He will not tell them where she is. He will take that knowledge to the grave. There is a law in Illinois now called Drew's Law. It remains on the books. It has been used in other cases. It has been upheld by appellate courts. It is taught in law schools. It has rewritten, in a meaningful way, the rules of evidence in domestic violence homicide cases in that state. The reasoning behind it has spread. Other states have looked at it, considered it, adapted versions of it. The principle it established, that a defendant cannot benefit from his own wrongdoing by silencing a witness, has been given teeth in a way that it did not have before. That law exists because of Stacy Peterson, not because of her testimony, not because of anything she said in court, but because of what happened to her. Because her disappearance forced a state to look again at a case that had been closed. Because her silence became, in a strange and painful way, the loudest voice in that courtroom. The law bears the name of the man who made it necessary, but the spirit of the law belongs to the women whose voices it allowed into evidence. It belongs to Kathleen Savio, whose words finally reached a jury. It belongs to Stacy Peterson, who never got to speak for herself but whose pastor was allowed, because of that law, to speak for her. It is not justice, not in any full sense. There is no justice when a woman is dead in a bathtub. There is no justice when a young mother vanishes from her home and is never found. There is no justice, ever, in a story like this one. But it is, perhaps, an accounting, a partial reckoning, a record that says, yes, this happened, and yes, it matters, and yes, we are going to do everything we can to make sure the next woman who tells her friends that she is afraid does not end up with her words locked out of a courtroom by a technicality. I want to come back, as we near the end, to the thing I said at the very beginning. Drew Peterson was a police sergeant for 30 years. He knew the system from the inside. He knew what evidence detectives look for. He knew what questions they ask. He knew how to make a crime scene look like an accident. He knew, as much as anyone could know, how to get away with it. And for 3.5 years, he did. From March 2004, when Kathleen Savio was found dead, to October 2007, when Stacy Peterson disappeared, he lived as a free man, a married man, a decorated officer, a neighbor, a father, a man with a secret that the official record of the state of Illinois had buried under a ruling of accidental death. What broke him was not a detective's brilliance. It was not a piece of physical evidence that had been missed. It was not a dramatic last-minute confession. What broke him was greed. What broke him was pattern. What broke him was his own inability to stop. He had gotten away with Kathleen, and so, when Stacy became a problem, when she started talking to her pastor, when she started seeing a divorce attorney, when she started preparing to leave with the children, he reached for the same tool he had reached for before. And this time, the world was watching. This time, the sister would not let it go. This time, the media picked it up. This time, the pressure on the state would not stop until they had dug up the first wife and looked at her body again with fresh eyes. Drew Peterson thought he was smarter than the system. He was not. He was just luckier, for a while, than he had any right to be. And when the luck ran out, he did what arrogant men always do. He kept doubling down. He went on television. He gave interviews. He smirked. He joked. He made himself a national figure in a story that should have had him sitting quietly in a lawyer's office, refusing to say a word. He mistook attention for power. He mistook fame for invulnerability. And when the jury came back, and when the judge pronounced the sentence, and when the cell door closed, and when a second prosecution came for him from the inside of a prison where he had already been consigned to die, he finally learned the lesson that every arrogant man eventually learns. You are never as smart as you think you are, and the system, slow as it is, flawed as it is, eventually catches up. There is one more thing I want to tell you about this case, because I think it matters. I think it is the piece of the story that I, Miles Ghost Hunter, carry with me when I think about Drew Peterson. It is not the verdicts. It is not the sentences. It is not even really the bodies, the one in the ground, the one that has never been found. It is the women who came to that courtroom and told the truth. Think about what those women did. Kathleen Savio's friends, her sister, her attorney, her pastor. They had no physical evidence. They had no photographs, no recordings, no documents that would have made their testimony unassailable. They had only their memories. Memories of conversations at kitchen tables, memories of phone calls late at night, memories of a woman they had loved telling them, over and over, that she was afraid, and begging them to remember if the worst ever came. And they did. They remembered. For 8 years, some of them, they remembered. They carried those words around with them. They lived with them. They went to the grocery store and they raised their children, and they went to their jobs. And the whole time inside them, there was this sentence that their friend had spoken. If I die, it's him. Don't let him get away with it. And when the call came, when the investigators reached out, when the subpoenas arrived, every one of those women said yes. Every one of them showed up. Every one of them sat in that witness box, raised her right hand, swore to tell the truth, and repeated the words. And when the defense attorneys came at them on cross-examination, they did not break. They did not waver. They held the line. That is what justice actually looks like in a case like this one. It is not the forensic expert with the confident conclusion, though you need the forensic expert. It is not the prosecutor with the closing argument, though you need the prosecutor. It is not the judge with the sentence, though you need the judge. It is the friend of the dead woman who walks into a courtroom years after the fact and keeps a promise she made to someone who is no longer here to thank her. That is what brought Drew Peterson down. Not his ego, though his ego helped. not his interviews, though those helped too. Not even his terrible decision to try to arrange a hit on the prosecutor from inside his prison cell, though that certainly helped sink him the second time. What brought him down was the network of ordinary people around Kathleen Savio, who refused to forget. What brought him down was the fact that his wife, in the last year of her life, had the wisdom and the courage to build a record, to tell the people she trusted, to make sure that if the thing she feared came to pass, it would not pass in silence. Kathleen Savio prepared for her own death. She left, in the only form available to her, a statement. She said to her friends again and again that if it happened, it would be him. She did not know about Drew's law. She did not know that the Illinois legislature would one day rewrite the rules of evidence to make sure her voice could be heard. She did not know any of that. She just knew, in 2003 and 2004, that if she did not tell someone, nobody would ever know. She told them, and they listened, and they remembered, and years later, when it mattered, they spoke. That is the chain. That is how, in cases like this, the truth sometimes, not always, but sometimes, manages to work its way from a private fear, whispered to a friend at a kitchen table, to a verdict delivered in a packed courtroom. That is the long, slow, exhausting, uncertain, imperfect machinery of justice. And when it works, it is because of ordinary people who decide, often at real cost to themselves, to tell the truth, even when it is hard. Stacy Peterson did something similar in her last months. She talked to her pastor. She talked to her sister. She talked to her attorney. She told them what she knew. She told them what Drew had said to her. She did not know she was about to disappear. She was planning for a future in which she left her marriage, took her children, and started over. She was not preparing for death, but she was, in her own way, building the same kind of record. And when she disappeared, that record existed. Pastor Shorey remembered, Cassandra remembered, the attorney remembered, and those memories found their way eventually into the same courtroom, to the same jury, in the service of the same verdict. 2 women, 2 marriages, 2 disappearances of very different kinds. 1 body in the ground, 1 body never found. Both of them, in the end, spoke. Both of them, in the end, were heard. Not fully, not in the way a living person can speak, but enough. Enough to put him away. Enough to keep him away. Enough to make sure that whatever else happens in Drew Peterson's remaining years, he will spend them in a cell. I want to circle back to the pattern, because the pattern is what makes this story more than just a story about one bad man. The pattern is what makes it a case study. The pattern is what makes it instructive. Drew Peterson had 4 wives. The first marriage ended in divorce, without drama, without tragedy, though the first wife, Carol Brown, later told reporters that she had been abused during that marriage and had escaped it when she could. The second marriage, to a woman named Victoria Connolly, lasted about 10 years and also ended in divorce. The pattern in Drew's life, as the years went on, was one of increasing control. Each wife younger than the last. Each wife, by the reports of those who knew them, more isolated than the last. Each marriage in its later years, characterized by the same dynamic, a controlling husband, an increasingly frightened wife, a set of behaviors that escalated as the marriage deteriorated. The third wife, Kathleen Savio, pushed back. She fought him. She called the police. She filed for divorce. She stood up, and she died before the divorce was final. The fourth wife, Stacy, was 20 years younger than Kathleen had been. She was 19 when she met Drew, 20 when she married him, 23 when she disappeared. She had less time, less resources, less life experience to resist him with. She was, by every account, making the same plans Kathleen had made, planning to leave, consulting an attorney, telling people she trusted. and she disappeared at almost exactly the same stage in that process, right when the marriage was about to end, right when Drew was about to lose control of her. That is the pattern. That is why these cases are not coincidences. That is why, when the police are called to a home for a domestic disturbance, the statistics tell us that the danger to the woman involved is at its highest in the weeks and months after she decides to leave. Because men like Drew Peterson do not lose control quietly. Because the decision to leave is in that specific, terrible way, the moment that triggers the worst. Understanding that pattern is not just true crime trivia, it is potentially life-saving information. It is the kind of information that changes the way pastors counsel. It is the kind of information that changes the way family members listen. It is the kind of information that changes the way police respond to that first call, and the second call, and the 15th call. It is the kind of information that, in an ideal world, would have been enough to protect Kathleen Savio when she told her friends and her sister and her attorney that she was afraid. It is the kind of information that, in an ideal world, would have been enough to protect Stacy Peterson when she went to her pastor and told him she was planning to leave. It was not enough. Not for them. The system, as it existed in 2004 and 2007, was not built to hear those warnings with the urgency they deserved. The second autopsy that was supposed to happen at the time of Kathleen's death did not happen. The investigation that was supposed to look harder at her husband was not hard enough. The institutional reflex to protect one of its own, a veteran police sergeant, was stronger than the institutional reflex to follow the evidence. Things had to get much worse. A second woman had to vanish before the system agreed to ask the questions it should have asked the first time. That is the painful truth about why Drew's law exists. It exists because the first version of the investigation failed. It exists because a woman had to die, and then another woman had to disappear, and then a wave of national media attention had to pound on the doors of the Will County State's Attorney's Office for months on end before the system would finally do its job. That is not a happy story about institutional reform. It is a bitter story about institutional failure that reformed itself only when the cost of not reforming became impossible to ignore. Still, the reform happened. The law is on the books, and every prosecution in Illinois that relies on forfeiture by wrongdoing now, every case where a defendant silenced a witness through his own crime and then tried to use that silence to his advantage, stands on the foundation that this case built. The law has been used to convict men who killed their girlfriends, men who killed their estranged wives, men who targeted witnesses in gang cases. It has become part of the toolkit. It has outlived the specific case that inspired it. And in that sense, Stacy Peterson's absence continues to speak. She was never found. But the law named after her has reached into courtrooms across the state, again and again, to allow the voices of other silenced victims to be heard. I want to say something about the final years of Drew Peterson, because I think they complete the picture in a way that nothing else does. He is in federal custody now. He has been for years. He gives the occasional interview from prison, rarer now than in his heyday, but he still pops up from time to time. He still professes his innocence. He still maintains that Stacy ran off. He still insists that Kathleen's death was an accident. He still blames the prosecution, the media, the system, his wives, his in-laws, everyone but himself. That is the final note on his character. That is the coda that tells you who he was all along. Because whatever else you might want to say about Drew Peterson, whatever version of the story you prefer to believe about any particular detail, the one thing that has been true from the first day to this day is that he has never, at any point, taken responsibility for anything. Not the death of Kathleen, not the disappearance of Stacy, not the plot against the prosecutor. Nothing. In 20 years of cameras and microphones and interviews and trials, he has never once said, "You know what? I did something wrong." Not once, not a flicker, not a hint. That tells you everything you need to know. A man who cannot acknowledge error, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, even with nothing left to lose, is a man who is never going to stop on his own. The only thing that was ever going to stop Drew Peterson was an institution larger and more patient than his ego, and eventually, that institution caught up with him. His sons from his marriage to Kathleen Savio have had to live with the knowledge of what their father did to their mother. His children with Stacy have had to grow up without her. His children from his earlier marriages have had their own reckoning with who their father was and is. All of them, in one way or another, carry the weight of this story. None of them asked for it. None of them deserved it. The damage a man like this causes does not end at the courtroom door. It ripples outward through families and communities for decades. It shapes the lives of people who were children when these events occurred and are now adults with children of their own. That is the part of these stories that the cable news segments rarely cover. The part that comes after the verdict, after the sentence, after the cameras leave. The part where the people he hurt, his children, his stepchildren, the siblings and friends and parents of the women he killed or made disappear, have to figure out how to keep going. That part does not make for good television. But it is, in many ways, the truest part of the story, because it is the part that never ends. And so we come to the end of this one, the end of the episode, the end of what I can tell you about the cop who married 4 times and buried 2 wives. There is no clean ending. There is no moment of triumph. There is no catharsis. There is only a verdict. There is only a sentence. There is only a man in a cell who will die there, and 2 families who are still, in one way or another, waiting. One of them waiting for the return of remains that may never be recovered. The other waiting for the answer to a question, why, that may never be given. But I want to leave you with this, because I think this matters. I think the most important thing about this case, the thing that I want you to take away from this story, is not the badge, not the bathtub, not the smirk, not the law that bears his name. The most important thing is the voice of a woman speaking to her friends at a kitchen table in 2003, saying a sentence that the system was not yet ready to hear. If I die, it's him. Don't let him get away with it. That voice, that sentence, it took 8 years to reach a jury. It took a change in state law to reach a jury. It took a second woman disappearing to reach a jury. But it got there. It got there, and it did its job. It did the last thing its speaker had asked it to do. It refused to let him get away with it. That is the story. That is what Kathleen Savio accomplished, without ever knowing she had accomplished it, by telling the people she trusted what she feared. That is what Stacy Peterson accomplished, without ever knowing she had accomplished it, by telling her pastor what she had heard. 2 women, in 2 different kitchens, in 2 different moments, with 2 different pastors and sisters and friends, speaking truths into the air. And years later, those truths gathering themselves together and walking into a courtroom and sitting down in a witness box and doing, finally, what the women who had first spoken them could no longer do for themselves. That is not nothing. That is a great deal. It is not enough. It is never enough. But it is a great deal. He was a police sergeant with 30 years on the job. He had buried 1 wife and told America the next one ran away. He thought he had thought of everything. He knew how to investigate a crime. He also knew how to commit one. And the law written in her name made sure he never walked free again. That is Drew Peterson. That is the story. That is the file. Miles, Ghost Hunter, signing off on this one. You stay safe out there. You listen to the women in your life when they tell you they are afraid. You remember what they said. You keep the record, if no one else will. Because sometimes, in cases like this one, the record is all we have. And sometimes, in cases like this one, the record is enough. Not enough to bring them back. Never enough for that. But enough to make sure the man who took them pays. Enough to make sure the law remembers. Enough to make sure the next woman who walks into a kitchen and tells her friend that she is afraid is heard a little faster, taken a little more seriously, protected a little better than the ones who came before her. Drew Peterson used his badge to hide. Our next defendant used a teenage boy as a weapon, and it took a best friend with a hidden microphone to stop her. Episode 6. Pamela Smart, the teacher, and the tape. That one is coming. You are not going to want to miss it. Until then, stay curious, stay skeptical. And whatever you do, keep listening to the women in your life. Because the next Kathleen, the next Stacy, may be speaking right now, and the only question is whether somebody is going to hear her in time. Miles Ghost Hunter, out.